We left off here, major social issues of the 1980s, which will be our context and preparatory material for looking at the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who you see in the upper right, kind of the epitome of the kind of conservative that we looked at the beginning of this unit. We're trying to find some of the intellectual origins of the new conservatism. What were the big issues of the 80s? I've just picked out three of the biggest for reasons of time. The first, the AIDS crisis and epidemic, which was a scourge in many ways, of course it still is. It's still with us, but medicine and treatment has gotten much better. But in the early days in the 1980s, the confirmed cases were difficult to treat, partially because not enough was known about it yet. As Professor Patterson says, gay and lesbian rights activism grew during the 1980s, galvanized in part by the discovery of a devastating disease, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, because initially the disease disproportionately affected male homosexuals in the U.S. Activists mobilized to promote public funding for AIDS education, prevention, and treatment. So this tragedy, ongoing tragedy, did at least sort of spark the movement sort of back to life again. Not that it had been entirely dormant, but so gay rights were back on the front pages again, partly, mainly because of AIDS, the epidemic here. It should be noted that the Reagan administration and Reagan himself were slow to act on this and got tons of criticism, I think correctly for it. It's one of the, I think, big negatives of President Reagan's presidency itself, that he did move slowly on this, and it may have been because of ideas, old-fashioned, outmoded ideas about homosexuality that really have no place in our society today. So it's definitely a demerit for President Reagan on response to this. Also, the 80s brought huge drug issues, mainly cocaine and crack, for rock cocaine, and there's sort of a whole culture developed around this. Movies, you see Scarface there, everybody's favorite or second favorite movie. Cocaine in the, I think that's cocaine in the right there. So a number of books, very controversial, written about the war on drugs and how the crack epidemic was affecting the United States and sort of where it was coming from, who's behind it, etc. As H.W. Brands says in a book called American Dreams, about America since World War II, the war on drugs became an enduring feature of American domestic politics and foreign policy. Over the course of the ensuing decades, the federal government would spend hundreds of billions of dollars on the project. Several states and the federal government rewrote criminal codes to punish violators of drug laws more harshly. Prison populations swelled with convicted offenders. Candidates for elective office vied to present themselves as the ones most willing and able to bring the drug pushers and traffickers to justice. So we see the repercussions of this to this day, and it's controversial to this day. The huge prison population we have, many of them drug offenders, and so it's a raging issue. Many want to believe that we should not have as many drug offenders in prisons for lots of reasons, but not everyone feels that way. So again, controversial, but this is one of the big issues of the 1980s, and a divisive one, and of course a dangerous one. There were new environmental issues. I didn't talk about the environmental issues of the 70s and before, but this did get a lot of attention and was sort of a subject of a lot of worry at the time. Both the ozone layer depletion and acid rain, different environmental issues, and they ended differently. The ozone depletion is an example of a problem, an environmental problem that was basically solved, and partially through cooperation of multiple nations. So I always find it to be a positive sign in what might be able to be achieved with issues like climate change, etc., since the world did get together on this one and more or less solve the problem. With regard to acid rain, I think the initial evidence that had headlines, showing things like acid rain kills life in lakes, and made it sound like public, crisis number one. Over time, more and more studies came out showing that not that it didn't happen, it was a problem, but that it wasn't as big of an issue as it initially appeared to be. So, but I like sort of these two juxtaposed because it does show open-mindedness on the part of political leaders and scientists in sort of making sure that they study things thoroughly before drawing too many conclusions, taking too many actions that are unwarranted in the end. The book A Climate of Crisis about American and environmental history by Patrick Allett says the early 80s bore witness to two new, more intangible environmental threats than before: the depletion of atmospheric ozone and the increase of acid rain, both of which had international implications and both of which became politically controversial. The implications included a rise in skin cancer, blindness rates, and other problems. The Montreal Protocol of 1987, not very well known today, by which all the major industrial nations bound themselves to phase out CFCs in the coming decades. CFCs are the chemical agents released by a lot of modern industry and industrial products that punched a hole in the ozone layer. So phasing out CFCs was the main way to get rid of this problem, to get the ozone to heal as much as possible. And again, the Montreal Protocol got the major industrial countries to sort of sign on to doing this, which they basically did. On the other hand, acid rain, after seeming for a time like a grave hazard, gradually diminished in significance and even, in the opinion of a few scholars, disappeared altogether. By the early 90s, most regarded it as a manageable but diminishing problem. So both of these at the time in the 80s got a lot of front page headlines and terrified a lot of people, understandably. But one of the problems was solved, and one of them was researched more thoroughly and found to not be as big of a problem as it initially seemed. So now we get to the presidency of Ronald Reagan, Morning in America. That actually was a campaign slogan in his bid for re-election in 1984, but I still think it sort of fits his overall approach to the presidency. Reagan treated the office and treated the whole country like it was sort of a morning, and a good morning all the time. So I call this the remarkable presidency of Ronald Reagan. It was unique in many ways, and I guess for good and bad. But Reagan brought a great deal of optimism to the office and a lot of energy. A firm believer that America was, it hadn't sort of reached its peak. That Vietnam and Watergate sort of hadn't sort of ruined America. A very upbeat approach to the presidency. Reagan was sort of a new conservative, a movement conservative. There are some purists that would argue that, but as a politician, as far as a politician was willing to go in that direction, he was it. The quote from Stephen Knott here talks about, this is first from Reagan himself. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer, not an easy answer, but simple. If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right. This, I think, is an apt quote to start with, because Reagan did sort of bring a great deal of moral energy to the White House. Not the only president to have done so, but it's not always sort of the something that a president sort of leads with. But Reagan did, especially in foreign policy. He believed in fighting the Cold War, partly, maybe mainly, because he saw it as right versus wrong, good versus evil. Reagan was a remarkably magnanimous man, Stephen Knott says, a man who operated utterly without guile and who seldom attacked his opponents, did not have a vicious bone in his body, contrary to all strained comparison to more recent leaders. He rejected the politics of personal destruction and was repulsed by cynicism, believing that the narrative of America was a narrative of heroic deeds, never viewed his opponents as un-American or as less patriotic or public-spirited than himself. Reagan serves as a reminder in these hyper-partisan and divisive times, meaning now, that there is an alternative vision of American politics that does not view it as blood sport. So Reagan was a very personable individual and just a likable guy, which he certainly used to his advantage as president. But Knott goes on to say, unfortunately, Reagan had a tin ear when it came to matters of race, and one could say sexual orientation, as you've already noted as well, demonstrating a capacity for obtuseness on such issues as one can see of his continuance of the use of the Southern strategy. Remember, the Southern strategy, the Nixon administration had rather cynically, on the campaign trail in the South, made sure that they, very openly avowed opposition to things like affirmative action, et cetera, to make sure that they got the white vote in the South. And Reagan, in a sense, continued this, or at least he was swayed by his political campaign staff and handlers to do the same thing, although it might have been Reagan himself. Reagan is a new conservative in the sense that much of his conservatism was about seeing government as the problem. He actually said government is the problem. So the anti-government sentiment that sort of Reagan brought with him to the White House didn't come from nowhere. Remember, in our intellectual antecedents at the beginning of the unit, we looked at Milton Friedman, who was just one of a number, but a famous one, economists who believed that government needed to play a smaller role, at least in the economy. Reagan kind of meant all the way around. I think it's fair to say that Reagan wasn't able to or didn't follow through on all of his sort of attempts to sort of bring about a smaller, more manageable, more modest government during his tenure as president. But nonetheless, I think he was serious about it, even if he didn't end up sort of fully, moving in that direction. Reagan in the White House, a strong distaste for big government. That's a pejorative term now. Opponents of too much government call it big government, and they prefer limited government. So he was definitely a limited government guy. But it had such an impact on the nation. This type of thinking remains a major strand in American political discourse to this day. But we should also note that it had been around for a long, long time before. We can trace anti-government rhetoric all the way back to the founding of the country, all the way back to the American Revolution, when the many Americans or colonists believed that a powerful national government, in the United States would become tyrannical and wanted more power to be in the hands of the states. And the Constitution of the United States itself was a compromise, in a sense, between those who wanted a more powerful government and those who wanted power to be more in the hands of the states. The federal government, or federalism, means that balance and split in terms of sovereignty and power between the federal and state governments. But Reagan was certainly sort of a small government or limited government guy, to be sure. And again, this is one of the main ways I think we can see that he really is a new conservative here. That he was so adamant about on this point. His communication skills had to do with his background. And not as many students know this as they used to. I sort of assume people know it, but shows how old I am. Ronald Reagan was an actor, and a famous one, a Hollywood movie star, not sort of a, at the very top of, the movie industry, but still, everybody knew who he was. Everybody had seen one or more of his movies and sort of, knew his name and knew his face. So he was a movie star, legitimately. And but his movie career started to sort of go downhill, and he took a job still on the air on TV with General Electric. General Electric sponsored this movie night once a week, and they had a host, and the host was Ronald Reagan. So they'd show a movie, and there'd be some talk, and it was, of course, to promote General Electric. So he was a spokesman for General Electric, but taking his movie star skills, still the MC of this movie night once a week. And it was doing that job that he started to get political, really, and that his views migrated from the left of the political spectrum. He'd been a liberal, supporter of the New Deal, admirer of Franklin Roosevelt in his younger adult years, and now he started to become more and more conservative as the spokesman for a major corporation, capitalist company in America. So his views changed from liberal to conservative, partially through that job. Then he ran for governor of California and won, and served a couple terms there before ever running for president of the United States. And I admire Reagan for that. He didn't just jump right into the fray. Taking the governorship of California as your first political job is still pretty big, but at least he started there before just trying to start at the very top. So he did work his way up in a sense. And of course, his name recognition, the fact that he was famous, people knew his face and his name, helped with popularity. We've seen many times in American history by now that ends up being true. It didn't make it certain that he was going to become governor of California and then president of the United States, but it helped. The great communicator was sort of one of his major nicknames. His acting skills certainly came in handy in sort of reaching out to the American people through rhetoric and speeches that he made. And he very much believed in speech making. So the power and importance of the president's use of the bully pulpit, as I mentioned in the Kennedy administration, who also was someone who did the same and had sort of that kind of skill. But he took his acting skills and also his engaging personality and kind of combined them in a way that made his speeches sort of from the Oval Office, wherever they were, personal and personable. He was much like his sort of idol, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Though Roosevelt was a liberal, he's a conservative. Remember, Roosevelt in his fireside chats was able to achieve something similar to over radio, which was even more difficult than TV. But that was to sort of make people feel good, kind of make them feel kind of warm and fuzzy about the United States in a time of crisis. And Reagan does the same thing here. Comes along at a time when Americans were reeling from a number of blows to their confidence. Americans, questioning their own values, America's role in the world, its place in the world, its leadership in the world. Since Vietnam was a disaster, Watergate showed government corruption. There's an increasing distrust of the U.S. government from all these things. The issues of the 70s we just talked about, the Iran hostage crisis, the OPEC crisis, on and on and on. Americans are reeling, and he seemed to be able to, Reagan, seemed to be able to read the mood of the country and then realize that, among other things, I need to sort of be sort of a calming, reassuring, positive, optimistic voice. And that he was. In my profession, historians tend to hate Ronald Reagan, but we are almost all liberals and progressives these days, so we are all biased. But I try not to be. I'm not saying I'm the only one, and I try to see things as fairly as possible And I think Reagan deserves some kudos, at least for some of the things he did. On this one, I think he was FDR-like. I'm not saying he's in the same league as Roosevelt in terms of his overall presidency. Roosevelt, I think for good reason, is considered one of our greatest presidents. But nonetheless, I think Reagan did something quite similar here. James Patterson says throughout his presidency, he repeatedly scoffed at the notion that the country had entered an age of limits or was tumbling into an era of decline. And he never stopped telling Americans that they had what it took to climb to unimaginable heights. The United States was as a city upon a hill, a phrase used by other leaders before, going back to John Winthrop's Christian charity sermon from 1630. An exceptional, liberty-loving nation whose democratic institutions were destined to spread around the world. He urged Americans to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds. Why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans. So to most people today, at least most young people, that sounds, I think, like an arrogant and I think a prejudicial statement, and that it may be, but it didn't sound that way to most people then. And not everyone liked that rhetoric. He had plenty of opponents. Reagan was controversial, but I think overall this did tend to make Americans sort of feel better about the country after a period of crisis where morale was certainly low. Reagan had devoted a remarkable amount of time as president to his speeches and was proud of his editorial skills, a talent that some of his speechwriters admired as well. Reagan considered speeches to be central to successful governing, and his eloquent public addresses were the types of public speeches expected of a head of state. Another thing I think that should be pointed out that, in my view, Reagan did well was take on the job of head of state with relish and deliberately take it on. What does that mean? It's only one of president's many responsibilities, but I think it's an important one, sometimes overlooked now, which is it does dovetail into or overlaps with his ability as communicator, making speeches, making the country feel better. But nonetheless, I think it's a separate category as well. The head of state sort of part of the job is to unify the country, to act as the leader in a way that sort of brings the country together as much as possible. That's oftentimes done through words, so that's where it kind of overlaps with the speeches, using the bully pulpit. But sort of rallying the country around certain ideals, reiterating its values, setting sort of a direction and a course for the country, kind of being its sort of lead figure. In Europe, head of state is usually the president of the country, but that's usually his main or only job. And they have a prime minister that does most of the politics and policy making. So you could argue, scholars have, that the presidency is an almost impossible job because it puts what the Europeans do in two jobs into the hands of one person. But the head of state role, Reagan took very seriously, and I think quietly in the sense that nobody seems to pay attention to that today, did it well. As far as economic policy is concerned, Reagan was committed to what became known as supply-side economics, or the supply-side school, sometimes even dubbed Reaganomics, sometimes even dubbed trickle-down economic theory. H.W. Brands, in a biography of Reagan of recent origin, said supply-side economics defined itself in opposition to the demand-side economics of John Maynard Keynes. And of the government during much of the period since the 1930s, the Depression. The answer was not to create artificial demand, which is Keynes' prescription, but to ensure soundness on the supply side. Reducing tax rates could increase tax revenues by stimulating economic activity. Reagan had long preached the virtues of smaller government and lower tax rates, not simply for individual liberty, though that too, but also for economic growth. A lot of the economists that he brought on board believed that it was going to be difficult to get Reagan to agree with this stuff, let alone understand it. But what they didn't know is that he, more or less, at least in a casual way, been studying this and believed in this type of economic policy for a long time before he even became president. So and this was controversial. Even George H.W. Bush, who became his vice president for 8 years, in 1980, when Reagan first ran on the Republican side in the primaries, Bush was running for president as well. And it was after he dropped out that Reagan brought him on as the vice presidential running mate. But Bush actually called Reaganomics voodoo economics during the campaign, when he was still fighting against Reagan for the presidency. Of course, he shut up about that once he became the vice presidential running mate and vice president. But he basically saying this is voodoo stuff. It's hocus pocus. It can't work. And it's been, again, I say this a lot, but it was controversial and it's still controversial now. In fact, the economics profession in many ways today is divided between Keynesian economists and supply side economists who hate Keynes. Keynesianism is demand oriented, and this is, of course, supply oriented. One of the first major issues that Reagan contended with and made himself even more controversial than he already was the air traffic controller strike of 1981, the PATCO strike. Alan Greenspan, former Fed chairman, said perhaps the most important and then highly controversial domestic initiative was the firing of the air traffic controllers in August 1981. The president invoked the law that striking government employees forfeit their jobs, an action that unsettled those who cynically believed no president would ever uphold that law. President Reagan prevailed, as you know, but far more importantly, his action gave weight to the legal right of private employers previously not fully exercised to use their own discretion to both hire and discharge workers. So there was a law that didn't allow federal workers to go on strike. And nobody had ever used it before, but Reagan made it clear and sort of drew a line in the sand, and it said in a famous statement, if the air traffic controllers aren't back to work, was it 24 hours? Short period of time, they're all fired. And he followed through. Now you think, well, that's very harsh, and it is. But let's put it this way. I support labor activity and union organizing, and I'm a member of a union myself. But if there's one group of workers we don't really want to go on strike, it's air traffic controllers. Why? Because will there have to be replacements? Well, maybe the replacements are as good or at least good enough, but I want the best people, the most experienced, the best trained, best educated, at least for that job, in that job. I don't want sort of the second stringers in there ever, at least if I'm on a flight somewhere. It's an extremely important job. So this is really what motivated sort of Reagan to take sort of the hardcore position he did. I'm not defending the way he did it per se, although I'm not. I'm agnostic on this, as I try to be much of the time. Reagan's behavior, according to James Patterson, not only broke the strike, it further demoralized organized labor. So this might have been an intentional message sent by Reagan and his advisors. That's what Greenspan and Patterson are saying here, is that this actually was, at least the corporate America took this as a sign. Aha, this administration is not going to be labor or union friendly. It's going to be corporation friendly. And we can now advance on and act aggressively in denying unions in this industry and that. Right, to the demands they're making and fight their strikes, et cetera, et cetera. Whether that was intended or not by Reagan and his people, that is the message that was sent, and then possibly a danger or damaging one for organized labor. Reagan sent U.S. Marines to Lebanon in 1983, sort of a hot spot at the time in the Middle East. All kinds of sort of militant Islamist groups there, Hezbollah among them, in the usual confusing mix of political, religious issues of the Middle East. But in October of 1983, an Islamic militant suicide bomb killed 241 U.S. Marines after an earlier bombing had killed a few dozen before that. So, as Brands says in his book on Reagan, the deadliest single overseas attack on military forces since the Second World War, and it would lead to one of the most humiliating acts of Reagan's presidency. After the bombings, Reagan had wanted to double down and sort of stay the course and send more troops, possibly, but his advisors, at least the ones that won the day in the end, said no, we're in an untenable position there. It'll only probably get worse. So reluctantly, Reagan did draw U.S. forces out of Lebanon. But I would say that, you can look at this from many angles, but one angle is that Reagan was often seen as kind of a warmonger president, built up the strength of the military a lot, and it was already a huge military, of course, before that. But he was sparing in his use of military operations. There were no major wars during Reagan's 8 years. Tiny military action on the island of Grenada. If you haven't heard of it, that's part of the explanation, or you can see from that it wasn't a major military operation. And he pulled the Marines out of Beirut. Hardly the act of kind of a crazed, maniacal, aggressive president sending the military here and there, to get shot at and killed and maimed, and to destroy other people in other places. So as reluctant as it was, he did make the decision to get the Marines out. Though, of course, he can be criticized and is for not sticking to the commitment, and so pulling the troops out could be a negative thing as well. Early on in his presidency, he showed his moral approach to the Cold War. Remember, this guy was sort of a moralizing president, for good or bad. And he made the famous Evil Empire speech in 1983, talking about the Soviet Union, when he said on March 8th of that year, let us pray for the salvation of all those who live in that totalitarian darkness. Pray they will discover the joy of knowing God. But until they do, let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples of the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, nuclear weapons, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil. I don't think you need much more than that snippet from that speech to see Reagan's sort of moralistic approach to the Cold War. And again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm keeping agnostic. Possibly the biggest mark against his presidency is the Iran-Contra affair in the middle of the 1980s. So some have compared this to Vietnam, or to Watergate even. I don't think it quite goes that far, but I know one scholar that thinks it was worse than Watergate. According to Professor Rourke, our beloved textbook author, the Reagan administration faced serious charges. The president's aides had defied Congress's ban on military aid to the Contras. Investigations led to a trial in which 7 individuals pleaded guilty or were convicted of lying to Congress and destroying evidence. Sort of the focal point of the incidents that led to the Iran-Contra crisis, and the focal point of the investigations and congressional hearings was the guy you see in the right, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. And the Contras were a rebel group fighting against the socialist or left-leaning government of Nicaragua that for a time were being funded legally by Congress, because Congress, again, the American government saw what's happening in Nicaragua as part of the Cold War. Again, part of containment, assuming that the socialist government of Nicaragua, left-leaning, was in league with Moscow, the Soviet Union. And the containment policy said wherever the Soviet Union goes to try to advance communism, extend it, we're there to put a counterforce in its way. And this isn't the only time that the United States decided to do it by funding an army of rebels that were homegrown, indigenous, who happened to be, naturally opponents of the socialist regime anyway. But in the middle of the decade, Congress pulled back and decided to pull the funding from the Contras, and then which made it then illegal to fund them. The Reagan administration, or at least members in the administration, decided to secretly, illegally, fund the Contras anyway. And to make matters even more controversial, once everything hit the fan, they were doing it partly by taking money from secretly and quietly selling missiles to countries in the Middle East, Iran, in this case, an enemy of the United States, selling missiles to them and taking the proceeds from that and transferring it to the Contras in Central America, in Nicaragua. So this had a number of disquieting elements to it, one of which was that Reagan had said, bluntly on numerous occasions that we don't negotiate with terrorists, and yet Iran has always been seen as the country most involved in sort of state-sponsored terrorism in the Middle East, and so they're selling weapons to Iran and to terrorist groups. They're going to get in the hands of terrorist groups secretly, and using that money to secretly fund the Contras, illegally. So once this came to light, it became a major, major scandal. And of course, the great question here, which I don't think has ever been satisfactorily answered, is how much about this did Reagan know? Was it his policy? Did he send these guys to do this, or was this sort of counter out of control? Kind of rogue actions, underneath his not so watchful eye. Either way, it does make Reagan, I think, rightly look bad. He's either inattentive when he shouldn't be inattentive, letting this happen, without his knowledge, or he was involved in it, and then everybody kind of covered up for him. Oliver North being one of the fall guys here. I'm not sure what the answer is to that question. Again, either way, it makes the president look bad. Though I think it makes him look worse if he was sort of, deeply involved in this. Reagan had an abhorrence of nuclear war, and a guy that kind of grew up, lived through the entire Cold War. He had been, gotten used to nuclear weapons, but gotten used to sort of the fear hanging over everybody's head about the possibility of nuclear destruction and Holocaust, and it horrified him. And you can see this in a number of features to his presidency, one of them being his support of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars, as it got dubbed by the press and media. This was a proposed series of defensive measures, defensive technology, which boils down to it would have put a defense shield, in theory, over the United States to sort of block Soviet or anybody else's nuclear warheads coming on intercontinental ballistic missiles into the country. So it put a defensive shield in various ways to stop nuclear weapons from hitting the country. Understandably attractive to many people if it could be done, and Reagan was really attracted to it. He said, and again, this is where, for all his flaws, and we've been kind of going back and forth here, this I think is remarkable in a positive way. And you can see his use of language here in a very sort of human way. I've become more and more deeply convinced that the human spirit must be capable of rising above dealing with other nations and human beings by threatening their existence. That's a sad commentary on the human condition. Wouldn't it be better to save lives than to avenge them? Are we not capable of demonstrating our peaceful intentions by applying all our abilities and our ingenuity to achieving a truly lasting stability? I think we are. Indeed, we must. Isn't it worth every investment necessary to free the world from the threat of nuclear war? We know it is. Those are ringing words. Now, Reagan understood that it wasn't realistic that this was going to happen anytime soon, not in his lifetime, and it may have been unworkable overall since the project was eventually dropped and not really brought back since, at least in this, with these specifics. It may have been unrealistic, but even if it was unrealistic and he was kind of, being naive about it, it does, I think, show the sincerity with which he approached the nuclear weapons issue and his sort of deep desire to sort of see this, incredibly frightening, potential problem that could destroy civilization as we know it. It's quite human of him to go this far. Those words again are striking. Maybe most remarkably is Reagan's relationship with the new premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev became the head of the Soviet Union in the middle of Reagan's presidency, and they, for whatever reason, when they first met and thereafter, hit it off quite well. I mean, personally, and developed a personal. Those smiles and handshake could be phony by both of them, but I don't think so. From everything I've read, the things I've seen, Professor Rourke says Reagan made disarmament, meaning getting rid of nuclear weapons or reducing them, a major goal in his last years in office, and readily responded when Gorbachev took the initiative. A positive personal chemistry developed between them. So Gorbachev was the one who did take the initiative, but Reagan was amazingly, surprisingly to most Americans, sort of open to not only meeting with this guy but working with him to do something about reducing the nuclear threat. Remember, this is a guy that at the beginning of his presidency had made the evil empire speech, calling this guy's country the evil empire. So this was a positive development, but it also, again, goes back to the same point I made in the last slide, and that is I think it shows Reagan's horror at the possibility of nuclear war and his willingness then to do whatever it took, or go to great lengths anyway, to do something about it. The fruit of this ended up being primarily the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF Treaty, signed by both leaders. See here, the picture below, in 1987, and the turnaround in U.S.-Soviet relations. The treaty itself banned all short and medium-range missiles from Europe and allowed both sides on-site inspections for the first time ever. So that didn't turn out that way totally, but the very fact that both leaders of the two superpowers agreed and signed a document that included a provision to allow both sides to inspect the other side's sort of weapons arsenals is remarkable. This was a fruitful and potentially very positive step. Towards the end of his presidency, 1989, that was his presidency ended at the beginning of 89, but the savings and loan crisis had been there sort of around. So the bailout of the savings and loan industry came just as Reagan was leaving office, but he presided over sort of the disaster that sort of led to the bailout. This was a case of Reagan's incredible faith in free markets, kind of taking Milton Friedman's and the Chicago schools view of markets as sort of the cure-all for virtually everything too seriously and sort of almost on faith. So this is, again, I'm playing devil's advocate here back and forth, but this, I think, is something that we should criticize about Reagan's leadership. Sean Wilentz says he could have checked, could have been checked had this crisis, I should say, savings and loan crisis, meaning sort of a form of bank, could have been checked had the administration been less blindly devoted to deregulation and restoration of the free market, his favorite cure for any economic problem. So that's a stinging criticism, but I think an apt one, for sure. Deregulation meant, stripping regulations, government regulations of industry, which was a a big priority of Reagan, and there was a lot of deregulation in the 1980s, some of which, by the way, I think was warranted. The airline industry, for instance, probably benefited from deregulation. But the deregulation of the savings and loan industry um, was dangerous because it allowed and even stimulated, incentivized a lot of these companies to take greater and greater risks, which eventually caused a crash in the savings and loan industry, loss of jobs, and Americans ended up footing the bill for a lot of the bailouts that happened in 1989 and afterwards, in the billions of dollars. So this disaster may have been averted had the administration kept up regulations on the savings and loan crisis, maybe even stepped them up further, and then not seen sort of, this, along with every other economic issue, as sort of always about free markets. The free market, the most free market solution is the best one. So, and again, I'm not making an argument against free markets or capitalism per se. I'm staying agnostic here, but clearly, I think Reagan's overemphasis, or his blind faith belief in free markets and capitalism hurt him here in decision making.